Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. We are now on week 3, and so let's have a little recap of what we've been doing, and then I will introduce the topic, the reading for this week, which is the rocket. So I'm doing a little screen share here, and I'm just going to pull up my main screen so I can use the animation. Right. So, thinking of a review of what we've been doing in the first couple of weeks, one of the concepts that we have been introducing is the notion of a difference between the modern and the pre-modern. And we're anywhere understanding the classical world and the context in which Augustine is writing, unless we recognize that there's a fundamental shift in the ontology. So that's one thing that we've been introducing. Another thing is the notion that there is a difference of ontology that can be described in terms of sacramentalism. We saw from the Boersma reading that one phrase used is a sacramental ontology. Another word that's very important, often used to describe this ontology, is the notion of participation, a notion that is shared by the Greeks, the Romans, the early Christians, and others. And we learned last week the phrase, the ontotheological synthesis, which is used by Louis Dupré to describe this ontology. And that phrase, the ontotheological synthesis, is meant to conjure up the notion of 3 interconnected realms, namely the divine, the anthropic, and the natural realms. These 3 are connected. To flesh that out a little bit, we looked at the video from Malcolm Guite on the 20th century English philosopher Owen Barfield. And just 3 things to remember from that. He talks about reading, not just observing the world around you. Why? Because the world around you is meaningful and conveys meaning. So you're not just looking at it, you're looking for meaning through it, that it is communicating something. And Barfield also gives us that lovely illustration through the word Numa, which in the ancient world simply means the 3 different things at once: spirit, breath, and wind. So there are, it still can be difficult for us, but those 3 ideas are all interconnected. So the spirit refers to the divine realm, breath refers to the anthropic realm, wind refers to the natural realm. And you're talking about all 3 at the same time. To breathe is to breathe in the spirit and to issue forth a wind. And they're all 3 bound up together. Okay, so there was that. And then just a reminder, too, of how Guite talks about modern science as one-eyed. It allows us to gain certain insights, but it does so at a cost of separating us from other dimensions of reality and tacitly and sometimes explicitly privileging the one view, the one methodology over other aspects. Now, thinking about what's coming in this week's mini lectures on Raka and on, well, that mainly, but looking to Augustine as well. So we've spent a couple of weeks getting comfortable with this idea of a difference between the modern and the pre-modern, with some certain terminology, and now we're going to begin to explore the pre-modern ontology in detail. We're going to start with Aristotle and a key idea that he gives us, which is the notion of analogy. And we're going to see that this notion of analogy is integral, especially to language. And language is something that we will now be tracing in detail. So we start with Aristotle, and then we're going to backtrack to Plato. And we're going to use Plato to set up Augustine's adjustment. So Aristotle is Plato's student, and Aristotle differs, not entirely, but significantly from what Plato does. So you might wonder, why start with Aristotle and then make our way backwards to Plato? And the reason is simply that Plato more directly influences Augustine and the kind of adjustment that Augustine wants to make to what he inherits from classical thought. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Thinking of Aristotle, what we want from him, what we want from this reading that we're going to do this week is the terms univocity, equivocity, and multivocal predication. We will unpack these in just a few minutes. If you want one summary quotation to take away from this week's reading, it would be this. He's not proposing a common univocal concept. This is Aristotle we're talking about here. He's not proposing a common univocal concept, but an individual reality that is common insofar as it is that to which all the different multivocal senses of a particular term must somehow refer if they are to attain and preserve their own nuanced meanings. I'm not even going to bother to try to unpack that phrase at the moment. We'll do that in the Raka reading in particular. But as you're, when you come back to this lecture and you want a summary statement, I think that's a quotation that you'll want to bear in mind, want to think through, want to be comfortable with, and it works really well as a summary statement. And as I say, we'll get into what it means in a little bit. Augustine, the mini lecture on Augustine is still to come. Posting it after you've had a chance to write a journal on it and to discuss it with others. Okay, so before we actually get into the Raka reading, as part of this introduction, I want to give you a little bit more detail about a timeline. For those of you who have had me before, I think you'll know that I'm partial to timelines. I like them. I find them useful for clarifying the progression of ideas. Not everything is dependent on a progression. Not everything is reducible to straightforward causality. I find timelines extremely useful. Okay, so just kind of by way of summary and clarification of what we've been doing so far and what we're doing this week. Here's one timeline. We can think about the pre-modern, at least in the West, in terms of a progression from the classical world to the Western world after Christ. And we use as a terminology for our dating AD, which stands for Anno Domini. And there has been a preference, there's been a shift in the language from using that terminology to using CE, which simply means Common Era. And then we think about the passage to modernity, something that we've already talked about a little bit, and certainly is with us throughout this whole course. So what that means, moving beyond the Enlightenment era. So let's get that little timeline straight in our heads and consolidate that. Then we can think about, okay, well, what is that passage to modernity? And again, just in an introductory way, we've looked at terms like nominalism. If you think back to the Burisma reading, he uses the word nominal Think of the Dupre reading. He talks about a bunch of stuff, but one of the things that he highlights is the 17th century. We'll be doing another reading from Dupre in a few weeks and come back to that idea. And the Enlightenment is certainly an important term, refers to the 18th century. We've talked about Immanuel Kant, so the lesser what is enlightenment. So there's all of that. As somewhere in there is the beginning or the passage to modernity. Last week we looked briefly, again thinking of the Dupre reading, there are already critics of modernity and the idea of the modern in the 19th century. People like maybe Hegel is the first significant critic of modernity. There are others as well, but he is certainly one significant critic of the notion of modernity. And then Karl Marx, writing in the middle of the 19th century, Nietzsche, writing in the 1870s and 80s, Freud, writing at the turn of the century, moving into the 20th century. So part of the period of modernity includes this anxiety and this questioning about what it actually means. And that carries on into a period that we have called the postmodern, which is a very ambiguous term, but one that we're familiar with and we sometimes think of as characterizing our own time, or at least maybe we think that it characterizes the time of the 1970s, 80s, into the 21st century. But are we content to simply call ourselves still just postmodern? It's almost a bit passé, isn't it? And in some ways it has been for a while. I remember writing in the 1990s or encountering the term postmodernism and wanting to imagine in my own work what are some alternative phrases. And one started to see terms like post-humanism and transhumanism. I mean, postmodernism for a while was very much associated with anti-humanism. And then that shifted, and the notion of humanism was reincorporated, but transmogrified with terms like post and trans. Even those, I think, now are a bit dated. And where are we at right now? So that's another sort of timeline that covers roughly from the late Middle Ages or the early modern period through to the contemporary time. One other timeline to think about, going back to the classical world, this is just directly related to trying to place Aristotle a little bit. One sometimes hears the phrase pre-Socratic philosophers. That term refers to Socrates. You'll notice I'm not giving you dates here. I'm not too worried about the dates. I, in the first instance, just want you to be comfortable with the notion of the ordering here. We can talk a little bit more about names associated with the pre-Socratics and why they're important. But for our purposes now, we want to think of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in that order. So Socrates teaches Plato, Plato teaches Aristotle. Socrates arguably doesn't write anything down, and that it's Plato who gives us the thought of Socrates. Does that mean that Plato is actually giving us his own thoughts and simply applying the name of Socrates? There's obviously going to be a part of that that's going on, but it does seem that, for instance, in the Apology, the speech that Socrates gives on being sentenced to death for perverting the youth, that what Plato records there is thought to be a very faithful recording of the words of Socrates. Some of the other speeches, the dialogues of Plato, where Socrates is the speaker, of course, you're getting Plato's interpretation and Plato's development of Socrates' ideas. And so you get Socrates, Plato, and then what we're concentrating on this week, Aristotle. And we're simply looking at one idea that is developed by Aristotle. It's not developed out of thin air. The notion of analogy is important to Plato as well. But Aristotle does some specific things with this that are really important, that they are a manifestation of this ontology, this belief that realms are connected. And it's an idea that is important to the notion of language and how language works. So we're going to get into that. Okay, that's all I want to say now by way of introduction to the week. So I'll get back to you in just a moment with a little mini lecture on the reading from Rocca on Aristotle. Okay, let's stop there.